Welcome everyone to session 1B of Generation Analog. This is again possibly morning for you, possibly afternoon, and possibly evening. I myself am in a Chrysler minivan in Los Angeles, and doing the best I can. So let me just say that I am thrilled by today's panelists and talks, and without further ado, we'll get right into them. Our first speakers today will be Antonio Pomposini Tabja and Daniel González Cohens, and they will be talking about the title of their talk is A LARP About Leaving Home, Reflections on the Design and Performance of On the Other Side. This is the panel on Homebreaking, so please take it away.
Thank you, Evan. I'm going to share screen really quickly. There we go. Okay, yeah, so as you said, our talk is about our LARP on the other side, a LARP about migration and leaving home. And what we want to talk to you guys about, or what I want to share, is our design experience, trying to conceptualize this LARP, and our game running experience and what we found from running this game twice with two different groups. So first and foremost, who are we? Daniel González Cohens and me, Antonio. We are master students at Tampere University doing the Game Studies Masters, and we designed this LARP as part of the Games as Art Center together with three other designers, some of them masters, other PhD students. The Games as Art Center, which you will hear more about in a later talk today, is a space run by local researchers and designers, and we organize events and games around artistic themes. We also try to create original games related to these themes, and we choose a different theme every month that we explore through our research talks, our events, and our activities.
Thank you, Antonio. First off, I would like to run you through a brief description of our design process, starting from a general concept all the way towards how we start to conceptualize these ideas into specific game forms and into a specific LARP. We'll get back to that in a minute. So we, as Antonio mentioned, every single month we have a different theme or concept that we want to explore through different activities, be the research talks, be the games sessions, be the research groups and reading circles, and so on and so forth. And one of those activities is game design, LARP design. And for this particular month, we were exploring simultaneously the concepts of identity and crisis. And this mesh, we usually held discussions with the design team, discussing what these concepts meant to us and what we wanted to explore with them. And as this process went on, we realized that we were really interested in also using these concepts to talk about our experience as migrant students in Tampere, Finland, and also about our growing concerns about how, well, Europe is is going in a very interesting direction politically right now. So we wanted to comment on that as migrants as well. This meant that we needed to both research about the topic of identities and how the identities are formed through crisis, which led us through a very different disciplines and theoretical perspectives. The Games as Art Center is a very multidisciplinary center, and we wanted to be as thorough as possible when getting inspiration for designing the game. We went through different concepts through social psychology, for instance, how identity is constructed socially, how identity is also related to how engaged and how related to specific groups and in-group, out-group dynamics are developed, how these group boundaries are permeable, so your personal identity can vary depending on how you relate to others and in which context this identity is being played out. Also from the field of sociology, we explored it through the lens of Pierre Bourdieu's theory of the habitus, essentially how the position and the disposition towards acting and performing in specific ways is related to one's own accruing of capitals that allow one to be positioned in specific ways within different fields. And well, from the perspective of philosophy, Antonio is the better informed, so I'll let him take the lead here.
Yeah, we also had a post-human subjectivity perspective as a backdrop. Basically, what we wanted to explore was the idea through the habitus and through posthumanism, the idea that subjectivity is configured through interaction within a system and in relation to others, and to conceive of our identity as migrants or as players of the game, not as something fixed, but as something that is in constant becoming or in constant changing as we experience new things in different contexts.
All right, give me the next slide, please. So, through these discussions, we arrived at what we wanted this game to be. Of course, we already established that this was going to be a live-action role-playing game. I believe this is not the space where I need to explain what a LARP is, so I will very quickly move past that. But we do need to be specific that we were designing this game from both the perspective of artistic games. This is both the idea that this game that we were making was meant to convey and communicate some sort of idea or message or emotional experience towards the players, and also that it was meant to be a chamber LARP, because we wanted this game to be accessible for people who are not that used to playing LARPs, and also to encourage people from also migrant backgrounds to come in and experience this game so that we could foster some conversation, some reflection on the topics. This game was designed to be played within a smallish room for a group of between 8 to 24 players, roughly 5 hours long, including the process of workshopping, that is presenting the mechanics and the meta techniques that we were using during play, how play would work, and finally, once play was done, we would hold a small space of talking and debriefing and de-rolling, as the term goes, in order to properly have a fuller discussion about our experience. This game ended up being a game about moving abroad specifically, and how our identities are formed from the place we're coming from, and how it shifts over time with new experience in new cultures. We decided early on to define it between 2 neighboring countries with very, very different cultures, and where players would form their identities and create their own characters in discussion and in relation to other players in very small groups, emulating, in that sense, smaller family dynamics in relation to other smaller family dynamics within the same country. Also, in order to guide and scaffold play, in order to introduce new ideas, we decided to include regularly scheduled events scheduled for us as game runners, not necessarily for the players, introducing new ideas, new concepts, and new story beats as play went on. And now Antonio will tell you a little bit more about the specifics of how this went on.
Yeah, so how did we conceptualize these 2 countries? Basically, we created these 2 nations, Nor and Tai, which were meant to represent radically different types of living situations and environments. Nor is inspired in Nordic countries in general. We are currently studying in Finland, but it could be Sweden, Denmark, etc. And Tai is generally inspired in the global south, no specific culture. We drew from the experiences of us as game runners, Daniel and I coming from Latin America, for example. But the way the game worked is we would divide players into these 2 countries, and then we would have them form households. Households in Thai, for example, would tend to be bigger, 4 or 5 people, whereas households in Nor would tend to be 1 to 3 people. Some people would live alone, and some people would live in small arrangements. And that usually depended also on the amount of players we had for each session. The trait cards had traits that we generally stereotypically associated with these 2 conditions, and we wanted to try and evoke character creation processes that would basically put together the players with the context and have them be more connected to it in a way, right? And then we would give players the ability to or the space to discuss with their family members what their relationships were, how they were connected to their own context, and how they would present to the other players in the game. We also wanted to take considerations into how we laid out the space for the game. This is the layout for the first run. And generally, we try to divide the sections into a living space, a workspace, and a social space. and we try to imbue the space itself with the aspects and considerations of, for example, comfort or living situations that are associated with Nor and with Tai. Nor had bigger spaces that were more comfortable for people, whereas in Tai, people were more cramped in together and had less general space or less comfort. So then, how did gameplay go? Gameplay run through a series of day cycles, 6 days in total, where players would run through a series of activities, as Daniel mentioned. In the morning, players would wake up together in their family units, and they would have a time to connect with each other, create social bonds, exchange experiences, and then they would have to move on to work, which is a space where we try to develop the feeling of social competency or of connection to a broader sense of the culture you're in and how you exist within it. And in that sense, we designed work very differently in each of the countries. Tai, being a more developing country, would have more manual labor, so they would players would have to fold aluminum sheets and then unfold them and then repetitively fold them. Whereas in Nor, we focused more on intellectual work, and we would have players give presentations on randomly selected slides that were ultimately nonsensical, but they would have to explain how they would generate revenue with that, increase KPIs, and whatever else. So both these activities were ultimately nonsensical, but in different ways that were related to each context. Then they would also have a party time after work where they would get to connect between households and socialize between them and for further connections. And then at the end, we had the circle of feelings, which was a space for emotional feedback at the end of the cycle, where we would ritualize an expression from each player through gestures or physical context towards how they felt towards the other players, about how they felt about other players, right? We wanted to make this sort of ritualized and not just a verbal casual expression, because we wanted to have some emotional weight about, or some reflection as to how other people are feeling about you in your performance within this context. We also sprinkled in, as Daniel mentioned, some missions that created critical moments for play. These missions would be things like government bureaucrats coming and asking you for things, clergy asking you for donations or charity work, criminals, which you can see one of them in one of the pictures, crashing a party and asking for secret information, asking you to break the law, and eventually representatives of the fascist party as a sort of foreshadowing of the fascist takeover that happens at the end of the game. So within these activities, players would be rewarded for performing well, and then they would get additional trait cards that would generate character development and further connect them to the context in which they're living at that point. We also organized migration every 2 days, which meant that players would exchange their living situations so that they would experience both contexts. The first migration set would happen at the start of the 3rd day, and half of the players of each country would move on to the other country. And then at the end of the 4th day, every player that was in a specific country would move to the other, so that by the end of the game, every player had experienced both cultural contexts. Finally, once the 6 days had finished, there would be a fascist takeover of both countries, which represented a final point of crisis, and players would be forced to basically make a case for themselves and ask for citizenship and support from their fellow players. Each player had their accumulated trait cards that they could use as votes and support for the country for which that trait card was for. And players needed 5 per person. They each start with 3 cards, so there was generally a shortage. And if you didn't manage to earn enough votes to earn a passport, you would end up going to the nowhere place, which was a place that we symbolically created, but was meant to represent death in some form, not necessarily immediate, but an eventual death, a existing without a home. So once the whole theater happens and every player has voted, we had a final ritual where players would make a line and thanks for the time, would make a line, would go into a bathroom or a small space, a closed space, look at themselves into the mirror, perform their circle of feelings to themselves, and then hand in their passports or move on to the nowhere place. And with that, we would like to take the final moments to talk about player reactions, and the emergent qualities of the game that really surprised us. Tony?
Thank you very much. So these for us, while it wasn't our first experience designing a LARP, we have not had that many experiences doing so. I mean, we have had many different experiences. Some of the members in the design team have had a lot of experience, but us two personally did not have that much, which it made this a very interesting learning experience in terms of designing LARP with art game ambitions. First off, one thing that we remarked upon was the idea that several different new gameplay opportunities appeared throughout the whole experience, thanks to how the players engaged with the situation and with the storylines that had been built on. Moreover, they enjoyed role playing, despite us realizing that the idea of the trait cards being given to players did not build up towards making more complex characters overall. As you may guess, the whole theater of fascism twist at the end felt as kind of unexpected, as I feel someone in Discord has already pointed out. But overall, we feel like one of the most important things, and just give me this one moment, that we found out was that players found ways to both reaffirm their own personal community groups within their own identity in terms of family and country of provenance, and also they consistently on both runs found ways of resisting authority and power. Overall, we wanted to share this experience with you, and we would like to ask you what you think about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Daniel and to Antonio, not only for keeping to time, but also just giving me a flurry of notes here in this vehicle that I'm sitting. I really am having a lot of thoughts about your work, and this is wonderful. We shall have a rich discussion afterwards. I'd like to invite Nick Orvis to be our next panelist and speaker today. And Nick is going to be talking about Wanderhome, which is incidentally also by the creator who is later going to be featured as our first keynote. So the title is Playing at Vagrancy, Close and Open Role-Playing Time in Addressless and Wanderhome. Nick, you can share your screen and take it away.
There we go. Thank you, Evan. Now I'm not sharing my own view of the Discord. Thank you, Evan, and thanks to everyone at Analog Game Studies for organizing this conference as well. I'd like to name before I dive in that I'm speaking to you today from the homelands of the Wappinger, Schaghticoke, and Lenape peoples. In this paper, if I can move on, there we go. In this paper, I'm going to briefly discuss two different games, Wanderhome by J Dragon, which is a tabletop role-playing game published in 2021, and Addressless, A Walk in Our Shoes, which was produced by Rattlestick Playwrights Theater in New York City in January 2022. I'm going to start with a little bit of background and then dive into the different ways that each of these games model time and, by extension, how they model the phenomenon of homelessness for their players. So both Wanderhome and Addressless ask their players to take on the personae of unhoused people to play at vagrancy. In their peripheral materials, both games also profess a great care for the homeless community, and in the case of Addressless, a really explicit desire to generate empathy and support for them among the housed population that shares their city. In practice, however, the two games articulate very different conceptions of homelessness. And what I'm proposing here, and I should say that these ideas are fairly, beginning, so I'm looking forward to feedback and suggestions, is that this is partly due to how these games differently utilize time, both as an actual fact and as a game mechanic. Addressless, for all of its good intentions, is a work of art that remains bound to the idea of time that reigns in the world of post-industrial capitalism. And as a result, its characters, too, are bound by that notion of productive time, constrained to act within a competitive system in which they're viewed as a problem to be solved. Wanderhome, by contrast, engages time in a more fluid and flexible mode that looks to the past to enliven its present toward the possibility of a more liberated future. That is to say, it situates itself in a queer utopian frame, and as a result, it encourages the creation of characters who are in a perpetual state of becoming, rather than a present-focused, kind of isolated struggle. As a shorthand, I'm referring to these modes as closed and open role-playing time, respectively. My thinking about these games is deeply indebted to Jose Esteban Munoz's foundational work of queer theory, Cruising Utopia, in which Munoz theorizes the queer utopian impulse as one that seeks to both envision and perform a radically liberated future, well aware of the deeply insufficient and indeed hostile present and past. As he puts it in Cruising Utopia, it's a backward glance that enacts a future vision. This proposal situates utopian queerness for Munoz as essentially both a collectivity, a social and interpersonal mode of being, and as a potentiality that is, quote, not quite here. This mode of thinking and creating stands in contrast to the normative straight time that Jack Halberstam, back in 2005, suggests is a mode of time that excludes not only queer people, but all those who do not engage with the reproductive logics of capitalist accumulation, including homeless people. The futurity that Munoz advocates for in artistic practice, then, is one that is fundamentally both queer and anti-capitalist, encompassing a wide array of people who have been marginalized by the neoliberal and lately, as Antonio and Daniel just mentioned, increasingly fascistic political and economic regimes of the 21st century. These regimes, however, are insidious precisely because they promote the notion that they're inevitable and perhaps even eternal or natural. And the well-intentioned performance Addressless fails to escape this coercive logic. Adapted from a Hungarian game theater piece by Stereo Act, Addressless divides its audience into 3 camps, one for each of the performers who are their avatars. Players collectively make decisions for their avatar with the goal of saving $1,500 over the course of 4 months to get into a subsidized apartment in New York City. Now, complicating this decision-making is the fact that the avatars have resources. Each of them starts play with 30 health points, and they have to have at least 15 to work during a given month. And each avatar also starts with $500 in the bank, which has to be spent on their living costs despite the need to save. As this structure suggests, time in Addressless is strictly regimented, core to the gameplay, and it's fundamentally scarce. It's an ever-dwindling resource. Not coincidentally, it's also linked directly to wealth. At the beginning of each monthly round of play, costs for the different housing options that you can see on the slide here are revalued, and at the end of the month, there's a lottery to determine how much income each of the characters has gained, with characters who are able to work using a much higher earning potential than those who could not. This structure is a quintessential embodiment of straight time. Your time is limited, and it has to be optimally exchanged for wealth. The key questions for the players become those of maximizing productivity and mitigating risk. The unhoused protagonists of Addressless thus are framed as classical agents in the neoliberal regime, which celebrates individualistic striving, entrepreneurial boldness, and the maximal utilization of one's skills and resources for profit. In so doing, this piece unintentionally places responsibility for economic success or failure squarely on the shoulders of individual participants. Though Addressless insists at multiple points, including in its playbill, that its goal is to demonstrate that homelessness is due to systemic, not personal failings, its experience of play largely suggests the opposite. The binary reward or punishment metrics of decision points combine with its focus on acquisition to make a game that can be understood to suggest that homeless people need only work hard, utilize the existing social care systems, and stay on the straight and narrow to get a little luck and land in subsidized housing. As critics like Adam Alston and Jen Harvey have noted, participatory art, like Addressless, despite its claims for democratization of the sort of traditional art world, is in no way immune to reifying the structures and thus the judgments of dominant ideologies. The fact that when I played Addressless, 2 out of the 3 avatars saved enough money to get into their apartments, which I was told was a pretty common outcome, exemplifies the unintentional sort of conservatism in this game. The system, the game's system suggests, fundamentally works. Stay clean, take reasonable risks to earn more money, and you can land in an apartment, which won't solve all your problems, but is a good start. Oops. The carefully closed time of Addressless and its focus on material acquisition stand in stark contrast to Wanderhome, which is a tabletop role-playing game that deliberately eschews both money and industrial time. In its setting and game design, Wanderhome works to evoke a sense of queer futurity and what I would call open role-playing time that offers a more fruitful, if kind of oblique, opportunity for players to role-play the unhoused. Now, I want to note that at first glance, Wanderhome doesn't seem to center characters who are homeless in the same way that the avatars of Addressless are. The setting, which is a pastoral realm of anthropomorphic animals in the aftermath of a major war, explicitly rejects a number of conceits players might bring to the game from our own world. There is, for example, a widely observed law of hospitality in the Haith, and since money doesn't exist in the setting, the game text is unconcerned with questions about where the characters' next meals will come from. Despite these distinctions, though, Wanderhome is deeply and almost nakedly concerned with the experience of being homeless. To quote its designer, quote, "Wanderhome is about homelessness, in about as explicit a way as I could make it." This is borne out in a close reading of the game's playbooks, the main mechanic through which its protagonists are defined. Many deal with the trauma or loss that drives the characters on a journey into rootless wandering, hopeful of, but not certain to find, a home. The exile, for example, is instructed, quote, "You once had a place called home. It's gone now." Similar examples of lingering wounds abound. The guardian cares for a young child with a likely hurtful past. The ragamuffin more or less is such a child. The vagabond is a criminal on the run from the law, and the veteran is a perpetrator of violence trying their best not to relapse. Not all of the playbooks are so fraught in their themes, and the game text is at pains to make it clear that Wanderhome can be as light and sunny as its players wish, but it remains deeply connected to the pain of rootlessness at a thematic level. Now, time in Wanderhome is fluid and responsive to both the diegetic and the playing space environments. It's far from absent or inconsequential, though. Indeed, the passage of time is one of the core mechanics of the game. Unlike other tabletop games in which characters grow more powerful as they defeat enemies or complete storylines, in Wanderhome, characters simply grow and change as time passes, getting to mark off a quote-unquote advancement in their playbook at each holiday that separates the game's 5 seasons. While the process of playing builds a future for the characters and the places in which they find themselves, it is always informed by the challenges of the present and the trauma of the past, as natures and months always include references to both moments. The game itself, which is part of the Belonging Outside Belonging family, is intended to be played without a game master and does not offer its players explicit goals beyond the opportunity to imagine and explore a world together. Time in this game is continuously undisciplined, set loose from the industrial standards of our world. Even the 10 months that make up its calendar are defined only by the changing of the seasons, rather than a set number of days. Within these temporal forms, Dragon creates a game that inscribes a queer utopianism both into its setting and, I would say more importantly, into its gameplay. Munoz's backward glance that enacts a future vision is woven throughout the game. Its focus on small everyday problems, for example, echoes Munoz's interpretation of Barthes that, quote, "The utopian is an impulse that we see in everyday life." While its consistent orientation toward the future while navigating the trauma of the past embodies the notion that, quote, "the present must be known in relation to alternative temporal and spatial maps provided by a perception of past and future affective worlds." Wanderhome also situates its characters in an ongoing, sprawling web of relationships rooted in place and thus in history and growth as well. Natures, the constituent parts with which players create new locations to visit, always include at least one new person that the group can choose to flesh out and form a relationship with, and each month further alters the character of natures by introducing a sense of what the people of a place are doing in that place when the player characters arrive. Perhaps most notably, though, Wanderhome's sprawling mechanics are themselves an example of queer futurity, rejecting notions of completeness or complete play and generating an open modality of role-playing time. Many mechanics are geared toward long-term play, extremely long-term play in the case of the seasonal phenomena that each month brings up. These ask a question of the players about their characters and their place in the world. For instance, Tillsoil, the first month, asks, "Do you know anyone here?" If anyone says yes, 1 of 5 sprouts on a tracker is marked. If everyone says yes, 3 sprouts are marked. When players arrive at Tillsoil and mark the 5th sprout, there's a special event called a Cold Leap, which alters the calendar for the rest of the diegetic year. At a fairly ambitious pace of play, say a new month each play session moving in order through the calendar, this phenomenon will take at least 11 sessions to occur, and even more time for its effects to be fully felt. This is designed for very long-term play, as other phenomena may take even longer to come to fruition. From my own experience playing Wanderhome, I'm uncertain how many playgroups will ever find these mechanics bearing fruit in an obvious way. My group often found themselves wanting to take more time than a single session for each month. Dragon was clearly aware of this in the design process, writing in the director's commentary that was just released in June 2024, fortunately for me, that this design, quote, is all to create the sensation that the world of Wanderhome is a continuous path, and so that you can imagine your characters having a shared future together, even if they don't reach that future in the moment. This mechanic itself, then, is a sort of queer utopia, envisioning a future rooted in the present and cognizant of the past, while knowing that future must be continuously striven for rather than assumed to have arrived. This framing, not coincidentally, situates both the player and the characters of Wanderhome as the ultimate authors of their journey, and thus a rather different form of agent than the striving avatars of Addressless. While the theater game figures lonely individuals both defined by and an embodiment of the problem of homelessness, Wanderhome conceives homeless people as members of communities that exist outside the bounds of capitalism. The community of travelers, the communities they interact with, including the community of other than human beings in the world, and the community of play itself. While both games involve role-playing vagrancy, Addressless depicts it as a problem that must be solved, and its avatars as innately problematic to the social order. In its closed time, players learn that they, and presumably others, can master the obstacles of homelessness and thus overcome them through judicious action. In allowing us to master homelessness in this way, thank you, Evan, in allowing us to master homelessness, Addressless distorts what the underlying phenomenon is. As Julietta Singh has argued, this is always the case, as mastery of a thing, quote, inevitably as mastery of a thing inevitably includes a, quote, splitting of the object that is mastered from itself, a way of estranging the mastered object from its previous state of being. In its place, the dehumanist thinker argues, we must begin to exile ourselves from feeling comfortable at home, turning instead toward forms of queer dispossession that reach for different ways of inhabiting our scholarly domains, and more primordially, of inhabiting ourselves. This queer dispossession is none other than the utopian, a way of being defined not by our command of a home, but by fluid relationships both internal and external, much as the characters of Wanderhome enter into relationship both with one another and with themselves, growing over this open framework of play into more complex beings. Possibly, as this anarchist game about becoming on the margins of society suggests, mastery and mastery and the utopian are impossible cohabitants, and the only way toward the utopian future is relinquishing the stability of hearth and home. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. And I feel deeply ambivalent about reintroducing capitalist time through this moment where I have to cut you off and bring in our next speaker. But I want to express a lot of appreciation for this talk, and you'll find some more on the Discord. Our next talk is by Deb Fuller, whom I'd like to summon onto the screen. And Deb Fuller is presenting a talk called "Wretched and at Home: Playing to Lose as a Solo Player." So take it away, Deb.
All right. Hello, everybody. On this, yeah, so my title of my presentation is Wretched and at Home: Playing to Lose as a Solo Player. On that, which is featuring the TTRPG The Wretched and related games. So going through my presentation, a little intro about me and my topic and the thesis statement, describing The Wretched, about playing yes.
Real quick interruption. Can you please hit slideshow, and then we would be so much happier.
Oh, shucky darns. Okay,
it's all good.
Hi, my name is Deb. I actually do this for a living, and I'm
you're awesome. Thank you so much.
All right, yeah. On that. Oh, oops, I just turned myself off. All right. Yeah. So anyway, me, The Wretched, Playing to Lose, which is a concept. Why do people play solo, and why isn't there more research about this? And also about playing solo with Wretched and Unhome, or the Wretched system. All right. Actually, there you go. Yeah. So I'm a game-based instructional designer, which means I design education and curriculum, and every now and then I get to design games for that, which is super awesome. So this is kind of adjacent to my job that pays the bills. But last year I stumbled upon this little conference called Generation Analog and all this board game research. I was like, what? This exists, and opened up a whole new world and found out about itch game jams and started to, put my own games up online on that. So super excited about this. So in the process of that last year, the one-page game jam, which is going on right now, if you've ever wanted to try your hand out designing a one-page game, a TTRPG, then the game, this is a great place to start. It's a great supportive community. And going through different, all different styles of games and SRDs, there is one that stuck out as this is the thing. And it's called The Wretched. And it is a solo game where you're doomed to fail. And there is a small victory condition in this game, but you're playing not to win. You're playing knowing that your character is going to die a horrible death. And which is kind of in contrast to the live action style of playing to lose and that concept. So it's like, why would anybody play a game that they would deliberately lose? There's a hopeless game. And especially since the idea of playing to lose is more of a social active, a social concept as well. So The Wretched. The Wretched is a solo TTRPG by Chris Bizet of the company Loot the Room. It was released in April 2020. You might think that date is significant, and you would be right. One of the things that's very appealing about it is a tumbling block tower game mechanic, basically Jenga, simulates your crumbled ship. And you are supposed to record your journal entries via a microphone. And there's also a custom soundtrack to it, but people, make it their own and do that. So you can see on the right there, it says you think you'd won, you'd launch the creature out of an airlock, and that should have meant safety. It didn't. The Wretched is a solo journaling RPG played with a deck of cards, a tumbling block tower, and a microphone. So again, the idea is you're the only person left on the ship. There's a creature out there that you thought you destroyed. You did not. It's coming back for you. You're trying to get the ship up and running. You're trying to send a distress beacon. It's very stressful, very doomy, and very alien. And he said he drew upon like the alien genre of movies and the like. So it was nominated for the best way to die in an RPG by Tabletop Gaming Magazine, and also spawned an SRD and a game jam. So this is, I need to see the chat here. I do have a short clip of somebody. Oh, mute Discord too. Ooh, sorry about that. Let me do that promptly. I'll just turn it off. This is a short clip from somebody who's playing it as a vlog. It is one of the less creepier parts. It does not deal with death or anything, and it shows you like how the game is played with the Oracle drawing cards and the Jenga tower, which is probably the most super stressful. Thumbs up if you don't want to hear this. I mean, this is optional, and I know it's triggery and concerning for some people, and I don't have to play it, but if people would like it, yes, no reactions. And obviously I'm not in the Discord. Okay, so I'm seeing some thumbs ups. It's about a minute, 2 minutes. So if it's too much for you, you can just mute. There's no graphics on it. It's just this lady and her thing. So hopefully sound will work.
Okay. 3 of spades. Describe the way the creature moves across the outside of the ship, pull from the tower. Okay. So the creature moves across the outside of the ship. I'm never going to see or talk to anybody ever again. I spent the day climbing around the engines, didn't learn anything. And my food might be eaten by mold. Cool. Day 7, salvage ship The Wretched. Flight engineer Hannah Ajrami reporting. I don't know how much longer I can make this work. If I even am making it work. I thought, you know, I should take some time. Maybe I could go through the engines. I don't know, maybe there's just like a big red power button I'm missing or something.
All right, so that gives you kind of an idea of how the game works. It has an oracle, which is you pull a card, you read the entry that corresponds to the card, and then you pull for the game, you pull for the tumbling block tower, record your entry. And people take this very seriously. I mean, they're all the ones that I've watched and I've read.
But
oops,
okay.
No.
3 of spades.
There you go. Down. So why would somebody do this? Playing to lose. Well, playing to lose is a concept that was first introduced in the early 2000s in the Larp scene, in Nordic Larp. And it's a social concept where you're trying to create drama by trying not to win. So, you know, there's lots of kind of archetypical, you know, losing players, star-crossed lovers, unrequited love, taking one for the team, you're hapless villain, Wile E. Coyote. It doesn't always have to be like serious or you know, a villain. And it's a collaborative style of play. So you're trying to create these dramatic moments versus achieving your goals or winning. Then there's another kind of corollary idea called playing to lift or playing up, and that everybody is getting their own piece of the drama. So it's a win for you, the player, not necessarily your character. So everybody plays to have a good experience, as opposed to complete all their goals or whatever. And then related to this is the Sega principle with Paul Sega, a game designer, who says when one person is the author of both the character's adversity and its resolution plays it fun, which is interesting because this has kind of been challenged and it doesn't, you know, it's turned out not to apply in solo play, because again, in solo play, you are both playing as yourself and also the, you know, the DM or the game master on that. So why would people play solo? Bringing in theater. I'm so happy people mentioned theater in the last presentation or the last things. But, you know, just as you enjoy watching tragedy, role players enjoy creating it on that. And then appeal of solo play, again, there's not a lot of research on this. I was really kind of surprised. There's solo board gaming, solo video gaming, but not a lot of research on actually solo TTRPGs. I might be mistaken on that, but I tried to research as much as possible. But people this is relating to solo board gaming and also pulling in some other resources on TTRPGs. Solo, you know, social anxiety, they don't want to go out and be with people. It's anxious. They need me time. It's relaxing. It was quarantine. It's fun. They've got a world building experience, a safe space for them. Interesting. Nobody can get together with everybody else. That would never happen. And then again, Paul Sega just wrote this amazing monograph called The Ink That Bleeds, where he muses on solo play and journaling games and very bleedy games too. And it kind of hit the nail on the head. It was like, whoa. It says, this is why journaling games are having their moment. Playing them isn't exiting the temporal world for circumstances where your life plays out with fantasized rewards. They are acts of purging ourselves of narratives that aren't in our interest and enlivening ourselves for the temporal world and the sense that we sense about them. So that really kind of turns it as role play, you know, solo playing is about you and kind of like dreamy and working through those things as opposed to like your fantasy of being whatever. But again, that ties into, well, my fantasy of this is this. What does that say about me? So how does this relate to Wretched? So Wretched is a zeitgeist. It came out in April 2020. What were you doing in April 2020? I was sitting on my couch playing a lot of Animal Crossing. So we were stuck at home. It mirrored the mood of the pandemic during quarantine. That tumbling block tower, as you saw in the video, is really a great simulation of a crumbling ship, and people really latched onto that. You also have the tactile part of that as well, that you have that tension of, you know, can I do this? Which is a great mechanic, and it's makes it very, very realistic. So it was kind of playing this game was mirroring kind of their situation. And there's also a catharsis. So this Chase Canner wrote an article in Dicebreaker about it. I felt some deep held breath inside me begin to loosen. It was an outlet for stressors, and it was around a central lie that survival was possible. And looking back on April 2020, we all were kind of like, you know, going to the grocery store was really stressful, and you know, and that. But he said it gave you hope in hopeless times. And then also going on looking at other blogs, it was introspection, which goes back to what Paul Sega was saying. The system enabled a gradual discovery of a single player character against a self-discovery. So going back, you know, into where it's your unconscious that is directing your actions. And leading into the dread, into that horrible, wretched moment that you find yourself in at that situation that you find yourself in at that moment. So that's again leading kind of it's horrible, we're horrible, let's purge ourselves of the horribleness, which I was surprised because this is not my type of game, and I realized why. I'm a happy person. But I was also somebody in the pandemic that liked it because I'm an introvert. I like people, but they overwhelm me. I like working from home. So the absence of any social obligations, you know, just staying at home with me, my partner, and my cat. You know, I got my little outlet on my Animal Crossing. I didn't need this outlet, but for lots of people, they did, which, you know, you hear about it, but this is kind of I guess not a personification, but kind of another reason for that. So I'm going to leave you with this last quote by Paul Sega, again, from the Ink That Bleeds. Is your conscience is about the truth of who you are amid the swirling lies of the contrived world, which I just think is a brilliant, brilliant quote about solo gameplay, playing Wretched and Alone, or playing the Wretched and related games. So on that, if there's lots of students out there, if you're interested in these types of topics, there's a wide open world for you guys to go research and to build on this. And I just find it fascinating and interesting, and hope it continues and to learn more about it. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Deb. And again, we're always kind of looking for avenues of further exploration, and also where we can begin to connect these different discussions together. So our final presenter here today would be P.S. Berge, and who has presented at least two other times, I think, at Generation Analog. And this one is called time to something exclusionary game platforms and flipping the good table. And so I'm looking forward to PS Berge's talk here before we then go to our Q&A.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Evan, and props to the Gen Analog coordinators for letting me put ASCII art in my presentation title. Let me get the chat up. Okay, so a really quick heads up, we're having a giant storm here in Edmonton, and I've lost power once during this panel. So in the event that I vanish inexplicably, just assume that's where my presentation was meant to end, and please continue on. But hi, everyone. I'm PB. I'm an assistant professor of experimental game design at the University of Alberta, and that's a new cool thing I get to say. It's wonderful to be here at my favorite tabletop conference. My talk today is Exclusionary Game Platforms and Flipping the Good Table. So today I'll be discussing part of a chapter from my recently completed dissertation, which was called Unplayable Games. I'll be talking a little bit about a practice I call ludo-arsony, something I discussed at last year's Generation Analog. But to briefly summarize, organized ludo-arceny, that is burning the game, is about abrogating the game as an exclusionary and capitalist project. The ludo-arsonist does not enshrine games as the source of play, but strives to wrestle play back from the clenching structures and taxonomic systems that would convince us where the limits of the playground lie and delineate what is and is not playable. And so today I'm specifically going to talk about something I call unbalancing play, a ludo-arsonist practice of flipping the table that sends not just the game, but the invisible cultural plane that upholds it off its axes. Over the course of this talk, we'll discuss what makes a good table, and I'll describe flipping the table as a feminist mode of interruption. In upending the table, the ludo-arsonist creates a literal moment of upset, one that echoes feminist interventions that might result in being labeled a killjoy or a spoil sport. Minor content warning for some transphobia. So the table is, as Williams and Tobin argued at Generation Analog 2022, weirdly neglected, literally beneath notice within game studies. Phenomenologists, on the other hand, as we've already discussed, love talking about tables. Sarah Ahmed's Queer Phenomenology is an exhaustive meditation on orientation, sexuality, queer movement, and especially tables, as D.A. Hall talked about earlier today. And Ahmed's framework for queer phenomenology has been widely embraced within game studies, and yet, weirdly, the central conceit of the table has largely fallen off, because, as Derrida wrote, the table is familiar, too familiar. The table has been worn down, exploited, overexploited, or else set aside and beside itself. The table, despite its seeming invisibility, is foundational to games. It is the ground that supports play. But of course, tables are also shaped by culture, something that's easy to miss if we ignore the surface underneath the games we play. We often see tables as the space where we come together to play games, but the table is also a technology of exclusion. Its edges are instruments by which one delimits who is and who is not welcome at the table, and the boundaries of the table are there precisely to serve this crucial function. As game spaces, tables are mired in gendered and classist politics of leisure and affordability, much like game rooms, man caves, and other spaces of leisure and play. The table is a mimetic refrain in game spaces. It is both platform and metaphor. The table is, as Braxton Soderman writes of leisure spaces, established only by aggressively defending and policing its bounds. Tables are devices defined by their edges, from kitchen tables and who is or isn't welcome at home to virtual tables. But my question here is, how do tables become instruments of exclusion? So I turn now to the key subject of this study, Tabletop Simulator, a software developed by Berserk Games and perhaps one of the most widely used virtual tabletops or VTTs. Tabletop Sim is a VTT by which you play classic board games and tabletop RPGs alike, and it's been widely used largely thanks to an incredibly active modding community and its tools for creating custom cards, boards, tokens, and assets. If there's a game you're interested in playing, someone has almost certainly modded it into Tabletop Simulator. But in January of 2022, 6 years after Tabletop Sim's initial release, something unexpected happened. Despite having generally received positive reviews on Steam, Tabletop Simulator's public rankings began fluctuating dramatically as negative reviews and some positive reviews flooded in at once. And this period was severe enough to trigger Steam's own intervention. An asterisk was permanently added to Tabletop Simulator's marketplace listing, warning would-be players of off-topic review activity. Reviews that were ostensibly unrelated to the game's quality would henceforth be excluded from the review score by default. And this intervention was part of a semi-automated response on Steam's part to counter review bombing, a term referencing instances where users flock to marketplaces and post especially low or high reviews because of dramatic shifts of public sentiment. But what had triggered such a response to, of all things, Tabletop Simulator? Well, let's rewind a little bit. Earlier in January of 2022, game designer and tabletop sim user and modder Zoe Allred posted a series of frustrations to its Twitter about an unexpected experience it had in Tabletop Simulator, specifically regarding its global chat function. While participating in a chat about being gay in gaming spaces, Zoe found that it was repeatedly timed out and eventually banned from Tabletop Simulator's global chat for using the word gay. After some experimentation, Zoe and its friends noted that any mentioning of trans or gay was met with an automatic kick or ban in the chat. After emailing Berserk support and getting no response, Zoe joined Berserk Games' official Discord server and queried a moderator there, asking for some clarification as to why any mentioning of being gay or trans was being met with kicks and bans from chat. The moderator then reposted a Tabletop Simulator policy that, quote, when using global chat, there is an expectation that discussion will be family friendly and centered around Tabletop Simulator, tabletop games, and chatting with other players. Zoe and the Berserk moderator had a long dialogue in Discord, which then ended in the following exchange. Moderator, discussing sexuality has no place in global chat. Zoe, why not? Moderator, shares link to the rule again. Zoe, so then it isn't considered family friendly then. Is gender considered inappropriate for chat too? Like sharing that I'm trans? Moderator, Tabletop Simulator is about playing tabletop games, not a place to discuss sexuality, fetishes, politics. Keep that to your private lobbies or public chats where these things are the topic at hand. Zoe, are you suggesting that being trans is a fetish or political? Over the next handful of days, Zoe carefully documented its experience with Berserk in a Google Doc and shared its frustrations to Twitter. This prompted a discourse across social media about relevance, table talk, and what does and doesn't belong at the table, alongside with the review bombing of the game on Steam. On January 9th, the official Tabletop Sim Twitter account intervened via the all too familiar genre of the notepad apology. They mostly apologized, donated $10,000 to trans charity, and perhaps most notably, announced that at this time we have decided to take down global chat as we reassess our moderation practices. And the global chat remains offline to this day. But the events of the tabletop scandal broke headlines across gaming magazines and newspapers. Charlie Hall, Chase Carter, and Kyle Orland all covered the original controversy and Zoe's ordeal. And Renata Price at Kotaku described how Berserk's decision to remove the global chat ultimately exacerbated a culture war nightmare. I've tried to quickly summarize these events because I expect many of you are unfortunately familiar with them, and because what I'm really interested in is the discourse that unfurled in the aftermath here. That is the culture war nightmare Price describes. So I did what any self-respecting game scholar would do, and I scraped over 1,200 Steam reviews to try and understand how this conversation was taking place on Steam. So with that, let's put on our gas masks and our gloves and take a look at some Steam reviews. First of all, amid the initial waves of posts, users posted negative reviews denoted by the big red thumbs down with simple callouts such as transphobic developer or homophobic dev. But this quickly became a co-opted refrain by Tabletop Sim supporters who began posting transphobic dev and homophobic dev alongside positive or thumbs up reviews. Next, frustrated queer folks and allies began posting lengthy essay messages attempting to explain the ongoing issue. And honestly, some of these essays were incredibly long and kind of impressive for Steam reviews. They even included links to popular press articles and Zoe's original documentation. Yet reactionary posters avoided direct references to the scandal and instead began posting over and over again, "good game." Over the course of the next week, "good game" became a kind of queer-phobic dog whistle in these reviews. And as more criticism poured in and the reactionary discourse shifted, a new dog whistle emerged, with many reviewers writing simply "good table," "I like tables," or occasionally encouraging other users to get tabletop pilled. Good table, and good game then became ways of reifying the toxic and exclusionary practices of the platform by invoking the table and the game as allegedly neutral objects. And notably, the tone shifted following Tabletop Simulator's decision to remove its global chat feature. At this point, negative reviews from queer allies largely quieted down, but months of furious reviews left by bereaved gamers claiming that Berserk had bended the knee knee, and lamentations of bring back global chat became prominent. And to this day, there are still furious screamers screaming bring back global chat in the reviews for Tabletop Simulator. But the Tabletop Sim scandal is hardly a distinguishing moment, as countless incidents of developer apologies, review bombings, reactionary wails against companies bending the knee have defined the last half-decade of game development. What I find interesting about the Tabletop Simulator scandal, though, is how it's a crucial example of how reactionary gaming culture and the game and the table as culturally situated platforms are deployed rhetorically for the purposes of exclusion. The argument made by Berserk's Moderator and echoed by reactionary reviewers on Steam is simple, that trans identity is political and irrelevant to the game and therefore has no place at the table. This is a discursive boundary setting that polices what and ultimately who is or isn't allowed in public chats, in the lobby, and at the table. Ultimately, the folks at Berserk, unsure of how to approach moderation or reconcile their own policies, decided that the table should be silent rather than a platform for spats about gaming culture. Tabletop Simulator's automatic chat moderation makes it so that queer identities are made unspeakable. Tabletop Sim, which is fittingly a ludic and digital reimagining of a crucial but often forgotten piece of gamic hardware, represents a mutation of the table as platform. The table is the invisible platform that underlies play, but is not in itself a playful object. And unlike material tables made of plastic, wood, or particle board, the tables of Tabletop Simulator can be anything: wood, glass, felt, stone, and thanks to mods, hovering cubes of space dust, sprawling fantasy skidyscapes, and holodecks. The tables of Tabletop Simulator may stretch and morph at the click of a button, but their shape is still defined to have rigid edges. And here we've seen how the table and the game are invoked to set the boundaries of play. That which is on the table is part of the game, and that which is off the table is irrelevant, unreal, and unimportant. But of course, the table here is merely a platform, and all platforms are, in some ways, tables. Tarleton Gillespie writes that social platforms shape the landscape of the content shared on them while avoiding accountability for content itself. Steam's role as a platform is just as contentious here. After all, an account called Horny Penguin posting the word sex several dozen times is, according to Steam, entirely relevant to reviewers. But the reviews discussing queer expression, moderation, and exclusion in gaming must be buried. And when our tables become instruments of exclusion, there is but one solution. We have to flip our shit. Flipping the game is itself a playful act. It exists within the feminist tradition of finding play in the interruption. This is not to say that flipping the game is joyful. It is a necessarily conflicted position. But we find ourselves at once relieved and saddened as the game comes crashing down. As we have seen in instances throughout this discussion of Tabletop Simulator, to call out the ways the table is balanced is an offense punished by eviction from the table. Yet the ludo-arsonist knows that the table is not a precondition for our play, and that we can find other playgrounds if we flip the whole damn thing. We can then ask ourselves, how do we want to play together now, in this moment, and only for a moment? Then, and only then, can the real games begin. This is my conclusion slide. Thanks all. I really appreciate it, and I'm so looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, PS. And I would again welcome all panelists now to turn on their cameras and microphones, and we are going to then have about a 25-minute discussion before we have our break. One of the big deals, again, we'll try and scan between both the Discord and the questions here, but I will say that the Discord is noisy enough that if you really want your question to be heard, please pose it here in the Q&A or tag me in the Discord and I will possibly see it later. I'm just warning you right now. We are very active in Discord right now. So my general commentary is that the link between all four papers is actually quite strong. And it involves around adult pretend play. How do you design for it? How do you play it? What's your experience of that gameplay? And then how do people frame it? in a discourse environment, especially where platforms are not your friends. I often argue that adult pretend play, or even what we now call LARP and live action role play, which again, when you say you're a LARPer, there's a kind of awkwardness or embarrassment there. And I'm going to take PS's cue as a Ludo arsonist and just embrace the awkwardness and the embarrassment. We actually should be awkward and embarrassed when we play and not just comfortable and, whatever, because actually the awkwardness is the transformative moment. But still, we can then I think use that as a linking thread between all of the papers. So my panelists, my question for the all panelists is, what is the relationship then between awkwardness or even negotiating social exclusion, or even so again, that line between I don't feel comfortable here and I am actively excluded and unable to participate. How does that then have to do with maybe feelings of home in games and play? Right, so it's a big question. So it also is a prompt for, if there's anything else you wanted to express that you didn't get to, you can also use this as an alibi to jump in there. But again, the question is, how is the awkwardness, even ranging to exclusion, then related to how we make our homes in games and play? You can start with the first panelist, Antonio and Daniel, if you want.
Yeah, I can start for a bit, Danny. If you have something to add, then you can. For us, we designed from a point of trying to make every participant comfortable and always safe and with consent and boundaries. So there's no space here where people felt excluded necessarily as players, but there are some corner cases that were very interesting. Of course, the people that didn't get a home at the end of the game had a devastating emotional experience within the space of pretend play. But we also had a specific case where a player played their character to the T, and the character was unliked by everyone. No one supported them, no one spent time with them. And then by the time of the debriefing section, the player had to deal with these feelings of having felt completely excluded from all social spaces. And whether that had to do with how she had played the game or who she was. And of course, within this debriefing circle, we talked about it and made everyone feel comfortable. But that was a very interesting moment for me.
Agreed there with Antonio. One interesting thing that I would like to add up on that is that, one of the interesting things that came up throughout play was that it was not that much of a comment, if I'm not mistaken, during the second run, but during the first run, some players did mention that given their lack of experience in adult role playing, they found that they didn't have that much direction into what to do or where to direct directions, right? Which is a common experience. However, despite maybe despite or because of that, they most often decided to direct their actions towards their immediate family members, their immediate family groups, which were the players they created their characters with, which produced this kind of interesting idea where part of us of the main design team, we expected that all the players would start to build relationships within different groups, between different countries, and so on and so forth. But the family group became the most primary center of both dramatic interaction and also of a play direction for the participants, which was interesting in the sense that we feel like we underestimated the weight that arbitrary decision of this is your group, these are your people, would have for players, and to the extent that this would create a bit of a barrier for them for interacting with others. We are still discussing how we feel about this process, and we hope that if we get to run this game again, we'll be able to observe this more in detail.
Yeah, I appreciate, again, this closeness and community that even enables play, also allows us to hurt each other quite well. And this also brings in Deb's argument directly about why we agree to hurt ourselves through games, and to what extent does that help us then formulate a stable idea of ourselves in the first place? Again, I'll open it to Nick next if you want to talk about awkwardness in Wanderhome. And again, I absolutely adore your framing of RPG time. I think it couldn't be clearer than how you frame it.
Oh, thank you, Evan. Yeah. I mean, thinking about awkwardness and Wanderhome. No, sorry. Now I'm thinking about. I mean, I think Wanderhome and the sort of whole belonging outside belonging family of games are games that uh, ask ask the players to be very vulnerable and open to awkwardness, because that is sort of a way of being in community with other people and a way of exposing yourself to growth. Uh, and I'm now wondering whether there's something that's sort of baked into that in Wanderhome, but I don't know if there's anything I can point to specifically, so much as it's shot through the whole sort of ethos of that game. And folks in the Discord have also mentioned Dream Askew, which is the sort of foundational game in that genre by Avery Alder and Yaziba's Bed and Breakfast and other games in that movement. I'll say, as a brief anecdote in terms of awkwardness leading to growth, I think the word I wrote down during the panel was dislocation. And I think that sort of controlled or deliberate dislocation can be very helpful in understanding the world more broadly or understanding ourselves more broadly. I had the experience once of playtesting a game called Unresolved Rage Game that was specifically built for people who were not Asian femmes to role play Asian femmes. And it was an interesting and revelatory experience, partly because of the awkwardness of one time me as a cis white dude running up against a moment where I was like, oh, I don't know what the script for this moment is, and feeling very awkward and dislocated in that moment. And which is telling me about myself, really, more than anything else. But that was a really productive use of awkwardness and dislocation, I think, for me.
Excellent. Deb?
So many thoughts. I'm trying to write them all down. My first thing that came to mind is what's your reason for playing? And going into that is play awkward? Play can be awkward, but then I've learned for over 30 years, I'm an old school D&D player from the 80s. So, there's lots of articles about there, and also experience, from friends too. Sometimes LARPs and playing make them feel less awkward because they're allowed to be themselves, or they're allowed to put on a persona that is not awkward, especially neurodiverse people, where they're in a situation where they're not the weird one out. And I certainly have, being one of the neurospicy, have experienced that too. But then, going back to my presentation and Paul Sega and The Ink That Bleeds, this bleedy game, his kind of central thesis is that your unconscious is your true self. And that is what it's disconnected from the real world. The real world is contrived, but in your unconscious, that is, the truth, sort of that. So that's coming out when you play, especially these very bleedy games, and allow yourself to journal the way your mind wants to journal. So that's one of the reasons he doesn't like 1,000-Year-Old Vampire, which I love 1,000-Year-Old Vampire. And I respect that. That's great. Agree to disagree. But he's like, this is too contrived for me. But a game like The Last Tea Shop, where it's very open-ended journaling, you get short prompts about who the visitors are to your tea shop, as opposed to specific actions your Last 1,000-Year-Old Vampire is very, you get shot, you kill a member of your family or something, which is horrible. But the tea shop is a visitor comes to your shop, he's a wayward soldier, and that's much more open-ended. So that kind of, when things bleed, it's your unconscious working those things out that you cannot work out in the real world. So lots more thoughts.
Yeah, I think one great aspect of this is that between you and Paul, you are in real time working out a aesthetics of solo RPGs, right? And now you have a debate of what does and doesn't work for specific players, and then you can begin to describe that in aesthetic categories. I think that's really fruitful and worthy of further discussion. And then also then, no, go ahead.
Oh yeah, so it also just popped to mind too. Again, American. I'm very American LARP and also British UK, that kind of European. So like Nordic LARP is, I'm familiar with it and stuff, and so I'd love to actually play a true Nordic game. But I remember reading an article a few years ago about an American who went to a Nordic game about gay conversion therapy, and it was like, why does this exist? And he was also gay, going to that, going, why does this exist, and how, and he talking about how it made him feel. And again, looking at too, like the games that are out there, there are some dark Nordic LARP games. I'm like, again, like Wretched, my first thought was like, is your economy so good that you have to kind of like role play bad situations, but also looking at that again about the awkwardness of, I guess trying to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, working through those things that you might not be able to work out or do in real life, on that. So,
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
the game you were referencing, "The Future Is Straight" by Torquil
Yeah, I
Edlund. I
think
think it's
so.
Stanley Wilson. Yeah, it was very high profile, but also there are certain interesting aspects of that design. Again, going back to Antonio and Donnie's talk, where there is it's about policing you, but not actually. There's actually no disciplinary mechanisms, and so you pretty much can go do what you want, but then you're like also doing the forbidden Catholic school sort of thing. I am transgressing against this norm, but there's actually no teeth to that norm. And to some degree, this also helps with this understanding solo games, right? I can always just ignore anything about, sort of the rule structure and go do my thing. And then what that allows me to do is ask, why am I making that decision? Why am I departing from the game at this moment? What does that tell me about myself? Turning to PS and the, I would say, very real but hyper well documented now,
Yeah.
terrors that those of us who are LGBTQ face online. I again am also interested in, again, this basic continuum between how people feel awkward in play versus let us forbid people from speaking and do even worse things to them.
Right. No, thanks for bringing that up, Evan. And I think this and the conversation we're having in the chat very much, I think, sort of mirrors this idea, where the thing that I found so interesting about the conversation about Tabletop Simulator and these Steam reviews was the like deep allyship that reactionary fans felt to the table as like a material icon, right? Like good table, good game, even as they're actively alienating other people, right? And I think that a lot of what that stems from is something that everyone here has been talking about, and especially Nick in your presentation earlier, thinking about queer dispossession as being in itself utopic. That's resonant with, I think, a lot of work out there on trans theory. I'm thinking of Hill Malatino's Side Affects in particular, talking about like feeling unmoored as an inherently trans feeling. And so something I think a lot about in my work on tabletop RPGs is like, what is it like for us to play in and with those feelings? And then what is it like to play in and with those feelings with people who do not experience those on a regular basis? And I think that's where you sometimes end up with conflict, right? Like there's a big discussion going on right now about safety tools in the chat, which I think is super important. But Olivia Hill has talked about this before, where like the X card doesn't fucking matter if you have an asshole in your group, right? Like the X card can be a tool, a cudgel to use against other players. And like I've seen that before, where players use the X card as a means of being like, oh, I don't get to play my character the way I want, or don't tell me I'm not strong enough to do this, or whatever. And it is one of those things where it's like, thinking about the table, right, as an object, is the table a space an arbitrary space where we are coming together to play games and to be in community, or is the table the thing? Is the game the thing that we are like engaging with? And I think that fundamentally is the problem, and that's the sort of mentality that we ultimately get to that allows reactionary players to show up and be like, good game, good table, even as they are actively harassing other people we're trying to be in community with. Yeah, no, exactly what Maka's saying in the chat. Like, trolls always learn the ways to use the rules and then like harm community. And then to link that, just one last thought back to design, I think then the reason that like Deb talking about Doom games and so many of these experimental games that we look at invite fucking with the rules. They create these deliberate moments of awkwardness and then encourage you to play in that. It's a way of doing what Sarah Ahmed's talking about, nudging the table, drawing attention to it. A game I'm writing about right now is River House Games' incredible The Treasure at the End of This Dungeon is an escape from this dungeon, and we will never escape from this dungeon. And that's a game where if you play as one of the classes, like the thief class or whatever, you write down your abilities and then just lie to the other players and be like, oh yeah, my sheet says I can do that, right? Like it wants you to participate in sort of this like weird fumbly figuring out how to play. It wants you to deceive other players, and it makes those social bonds interactive. So I think for like us as designers, it's like, how do we play in the awkwardness? How do we take those moments of disconnect and make them fruitful and productive spaces for intervention?
Thank you, PS. And so now we're turning to questions from the audience. I know Danielle, and we actually have Danielle and Daniel, who is another question, and a Daniel on the panel. So if you could, so this is Danielle Costello. If Danielle, you still want to speak, I can allow you to speak. And so unless I get a signal that we are not going to do that, I will allow you to talk now. Okay, and that it's vanished. So I'm now going to go to Daniel Hercheg's written question and then invite people to do written questions because it's easier for me. Antonio and Daniel, you mentioned that the genre of chamber LARP being selected for accessibility reasons. What COVID precautions did you have in place to provide immunocompromised people a safe environment to engage with your work? And again, as somebody who, you know, is a LARP organizer, of course, this is very much on everyone's mind, and also there are variable ideas of risk here at play. So Antonio and Donnie, what's your response?
Yeah, I was trying to reply through chat, but my question and answer thing has completely broken down. So I'm glad that you bring it up. I think when accessibility was first mentioned, I think Danny meant more in the sense of making the game accessible for people that don't have experience with LARP. In terms of accessibility concerns relating to COVID, for example, I would say that was a bit of an oversight on our design, that we didn't have explicit safety measures related to that, but we did make sure at every step that people were comfortable with the levels of closeness that we were proposing for the game, and we would have looked for alternatives if someone had mentioned that they had an inconvenience. That still doesn't solve the fact that it's a chamber LARP, which means it is a closed space. Yeah.
All right, thank you. The next one is for Deb about the Wretched. The question is, can you win if you are great at Jenga, or is winning literally impossible? Or is there an accessibility mod for people who can't play Jenga at all? And Deb, it's up to you if you want to answer this one live or in the chat.
Oh, I can do it live. That's fine. That's awesome questions. Yes, you do not have to have a Jenga tower. There is a link in there of alternate ways of playing with that. One is to roll dice, and it said they have D100s, take out the ones. The way the prompts work is that, you know, there's what I guess 52 prompts because there's 52 cards, and a lot of the cards say pull from the tower, pull from the tower. And so there is a card in there, a couple cards in there that you set up a distress beacon. And once that card is activated, you put like, I think 6 tokens on the card. And every time you pull from the tower and you don't tumble it, you put you take a token off your card. So if you get all of them off, your beacon is heard and you get rescued. But again, most of those the oracle meaning what the cards mean, have a tower pull or some sort of countdown. They talk about using countdowns or whatever. So the chances of that happening are, there's probably somebody who could run the numbers. I did not, but very, very slim. But it does heighten the whole anxiety of, I've got the beacon, can I survive long enough for somebody to hear and come rescue me? But yeah, that's just, there's there's so many moving parts that have to be in play for you to actually win on that. In fact, yeah, like I said, there's a link on that about that. Oh, people have put some graphs about that. More people who are better with these stats than I am. But yeah. But again, this game it's also your game, it's your journaling game. So you can just pretend, after 100 prompts, or not 100, but 10 prompts or 20 prompts, that's up to you as well.
The other thing that I think is interesting with the Wretched compared with, say, Wanderhome and other tabletop RPGs is connected with Nick's notion of time, where you just showed us a recording of someone playing this game in time. So we kind of see these game books as timeless objects, but actually they also entail a performance over time, just like music or live theater. And so this is especially for Nick a question: are we dealing with role-playing games as just a totally time-based medium that should be normalized just like music and theater, or is there something that role-playing games does to even transgress the sense of time in those media? Right. So, will there be maybe a point in the future, maybe a time in the future where role-playing games are just among a slurry of other media, or is there something that makes them special on how they handle time?
That's such a great question. I mean, I'll tip my hand here and say, for those who don't know me, I'm primarily a theater artist and scholar, and so yeah, I think about this very much in these terms. Because theater traditionally, one of the challenges when comparing Addressless and Wanderhome is I say, okay, Addressless has this sort of rigid, heavily time-bound structure, but of course, traditionally, historically, that's inherent to theater, right? You go to a place, you experience a thing, and then it ends. And typically you don't, except for some cases like superfans, you don't return to the place. And if you do return to that place, it doesn't change. So role-playing games that's one of the sort of circles I'm trying to square, is figuring out, I love this sort of open time mode that games, especially I think like Wanderhome, exist in. But then is that unique, or is there something about it that can be extrapolated or used, or does it transcend medium somehow? Yeah, I don't know yet. Honestly, I'm trying to figure out, like, what would a version of, say, Addressless that operates in that mode even look like, and I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us, when we're designing these games, we have to think about, what are our basic nodes of space and time. And I love, again, thinking of platforms as a space, thinking of your LARP space as a space, but also theater is just another space among many. And then we're just so ingrained to normalizing it that we don't also estrange it, right? And think, well, isn't this an awkward and weird social situation that we're in now? We're all sitting silently and looking forward at these people pretending to be other people, and couldn't we do this a different way? I think it's been a great session, and I'm looking forward to more commentary and discussion in the Discord. I have monitored nothing over there because it's just been so great here live on Zoom, and so I'm looking forward to seeing the wreckage and ruin and the flowers blooming in it over there. Thank you so much, everyone, and we will come back for Jade Dragon's keynote in a half an hour. Stay tuned and stay analog.
Thank you.